Thank you, Peter. I know that as it has been a long day, and tomorrow it will be another long day. Anyway, if some quick questions are, a lot of, okay, wonderful. So someone will give you a microphone. Please present yourself and also country of provenance.
Fatima, from Germany, but I'm working in South Africa, and my questions relate to the UK energy sector. One was just a simple clarification: does Ofgem regulate all three prices, so that the one that the producer sells and the transmission company sells by, and then the distributor? Do they control all three of them? And then the other question relates to the feed-in tariff, because they tried to introduce something like that in South Africa. I'm not quite sure how it works in the UK, but in South Africa they withdrew it because it would go against the competitive bidding that is compulsory to guarantee a producer a certain tariff. So how do you get around that in the UK?
Okay, price control. There is no price control on electricity as a unit of energy. The market takes care of that. So people built gas-fired power stations, and we saw coal-fired power stations close down because they couldn't compete. So there's no price controls. The controls are really around the quality of service and those sort of good things. In regard to the monopoly businesses of transmission and distribution, those system operators have to make a business case to Ofgem for the forthcoming period on what it's going to invest, and Ofgem agree those prices with them. So these are set in advance of the period. So that's how they deal with the use of system charges for both the transmission and distribution network. Feed-in tariff. These are really about trying to promote the right sort of technology, and these FITs are reasonably new in the UK, and they aim to try and promote much smaller levels of generation. So the renewable obligation certificates dealt with the very large-scale generation. But they found that small generators, small CHP and micro renewables didn't get a look in really, couldn't really compete with the big market ROC system. So they've introduced this feed-in tariff really to promote the small localized generation of electricity, the decentralized energy type thing. So they have a certain amount of money available that they collect from, I believe the consumers pay for it eventually. So it promotes things like photovoltaics, it promotes wind and micro wind generation and small CHP. There's another incentive mechanism called the renewable heat incentive that I mentioned this morning that deals with the heat side of things.
Another question?
Thank you. It's very related. It's about the self-production of energy, if it is considered in England, and if it's working or is not working.
So how do you mean the self-production of?
Yes, for example, in Mexico, right now there is a federal policy to switch. They install some panels in your roof, and then you produce your own electricity. And even though, like myself, that I live alone, I produce more than I consume, so I sell to the state my self-production of energy.
Yeah, we have exactly the same system here in the UK under the feed-in tariff. I think there's three components to things like photovoltaics. The fact they give you, there's a grant subsidy to install them, I believe, at domestic level. I think I'm right in that. It'll obviously displace the electricity that you would normally consume, and you will also get a payment for the electricity you generate, and also the local electricity supplier will buy the electricity off you at market level, whatever that market price is not usually very much actually. So I think I'm right in what I say. I might need to check on that, but the principles seem very similar.
Okay. Thank you very much for all the... Oh,
That's fine. If there's no time, that's fine.
okay. There is room.
Thank you. Actually, I have 3 comments and related questions to the other panelists so that they can also do their homework. Jihad, you mentioned actually the concession contract in the French system, insisting on the fact that it was not the most developed ones in the different PPP contracts. But this is the model that was developed by French companies outside systematically in the 1990s. All the concession contracts that were signed by Suez and so on in Latin America were based on this model. And there was also something in your presentation on this regulatory model, and some economists have actually developed this thesis that maybe we don't need an independent regulator because look at France, we don't have an independent national regulator. We have a regulation by contract, and that works very well. But that works very well because you have the accountability mechanisms in France that make it feasible to work very well. You have the Cour des Comptes that is on a regular basis publishing reports pointing out corruption and integrity issues in the sector. In other countries, you may not have these accountability mechanisms, and that explains why, in parallel to the concession contracts in Latin America, they had to set up, very often because development banks insisted on that, independent regulators. So I was wondering how this has evolved over the past 10 years and whether it's still the case or not. On Algeria, you insisted very much on the decentralization, and I'm quite sad to see that you have inherited from all the problems of the French decentralization system, actually, that has been almost replicated on the very same basis with all the complexity that it means. And I was wondering what was the political argument today for not pushing this decentralization forward. Very often what we see in Africa is that governments say that there is an issue of corruption, and the reason why we don't relinquish power to local authorities is because they're corrupted and they don't have the capacity and so on. I'm wondering whether at central government level there is this discourse, or whether it's just a capacity issue actually that does not allow the maturity of the decentralization that has been engaged to go on. And the last question that is just a piece of information on Portugal. I saw recently that Portugal had somewhat delayed the commitment to deliver the river basin management plans to the European Commission. And when I spoke to some Portuguese officials from the central administrations, they insisted very much on this regulatory reform, saying, and the decentralization process, saying that this is where our attention was focused over the past 5 years, and this is why we are so late in other areas. Is this new regulator having prerogatives as far as monitoring the enforcement of EU legislation in general, or is it out of its scope and the framework only a national one? Thank you.
Okay, for the first point concerning concessions, we used to use concession in the French history a lot, but what I mentioned in my presentation that lately we have very few cases of concession contracts, especially in water services. Now, in wastewater services, you may find few cases of concession, but the lease contracts are the dominant contracts used in France. I do agree with you that we are using concession contracts overseas. Let's take the case or cases in Latin America or in Southeast Asia and Africa and so on. We use these contracts, and we're still using the same contracts, concession contracts. Concerning the second point, we tried in 1999 to establish what we call a national regulatory agency. And if you do remember, after the presidential election in 2002, we just put this project on the shelf. So I think it is a political matter. not to introduce or not to establish a regulatory agency in the water sector for political reasons, for strategic and reasons too. And remember, France pushed the not to introduce public services in the WTO negotiation for, of course, these reasons too. Now, we have over 1,500 water utilities, and you have about over 14,500 wastewater utilities. So imagine if you're gonna settle down such an authority, it's gonna be very hard. And second point is you have to change the communal code, which is at one point you have to change the constitution because it's gonna be an overlapping on the responsibility of the commune or local authorities. My colleague.
Is it good? Yes, thank you for the reflection. I agree about the central problem of the decentralization because it's something which is it is an heritage about French colonization. But I think that about management of water, there is something which is spoken for us about governance. Because when I take a community, we think that even in Sahara or in mountains, in Kabylia, for instance, there is means of governance by local assembly and also means of regulatory, even for water, because population there is high water is a high symbolic resource. That's why in the culture of this population, millenaric population, there is all these things which are appropriate, and we secrete means of governance of these resources. And I think that's why in the actual system organization administrative, we stay in something which is think in external area, not in internal area. That's why means of regulation which are put now in laws had not effectiveness, and there is a lot of il y a des pertes, a lot of looseness. Yes, because there is resources, enough resources even for Sahara in the mountain about these dams, the construction of dams and another dams, because there is a lot of resources. There is financial possibilities in this country about the resources on hydrocarbons, but there is a lot of looseness, and also there is a lack of quality of water. There is this problem also even in the public health, dans les politiques publiques de santé. There is a lot of amelioration, but la qualité de l'eau laisse à désirer. Voilà, je vous remercie. J'espère que je peux dire.
Okay, so in the regulator that I talked about, the water and waste regulator, they have no responsibility to any of the EU directives except drinking water quality. So that's the only EU directive that they control, that they're the national authority for. Everything else is done by either INAG, which is the water authority, or the newly created river basin districts. And it is true that the river basin plans were delayed because there was a 5-year period. You may remember that, the Water Framework Directive was approved in 2000. You may remember that the guy who was working at it at the time, Portugal had the rotating presidency of the commission, so it was drafted very much with the input of the Portuguese guy at the time, who was António Gonçalves Henriques. He was the head of the National Water Authority, and it took 5 years for the Portuguese law to reflect the Water Framework Directive. So there was a 5-year period when people were arguing very much about whether we wanted river basin districts or not, because we didn't used to have them before. So it's true that everything sort of was delayed. So the water authorities were created at the end of 2005. I mean, legally created at the end of 2005. They were actually set up in 2008. And so the river basin plans started in 2009. So it was like impossible to have them ready in 2010. And it is true. And these are the authorities that have to answer to the European Commission on most of the other directives. So the Urban Wastewater Directive, the Water Framework Directive, they're not, this regulator we talked about does not have any of those responsibilities.
Thank you. I think that most of the issue raised by public and by the speakers will have a follow-up in the classroom in the next day, and for sure, in particular in the working groups that we are going to build up starting from tomorrow, I presume. And so, thank you very much to all speakers and participants, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.